Hello students, welcome again. Students, in today's video lecture, we want to discuss Robert Browning as a Victorian poet, Browning as a poet of dramatic monologues, and we will discuss the element of hope and optimism in Robert Browning's poetry. So now let's begin. See, when we talk about the 19th century or when we talk about the Victorian era, in the field of poetry, remember we have two great names. One is Alfred Tennyson, who is also the poet laureate of England during the Victorian era, and the second one is Robert Browning. On Alfred Tennyson, I have already uploaded one video, and today we want to discuss Browning's contribution to English poetry during this Victorian age. You see, Browning, just like Alfred Tennyson, has been considered as a dazzling star in the sky, in the galaxy, in the firmament of English poetry during this Victorian period. Why? Because he is mainly known for his dramatic monologues, mainly known for his love poetry. These are the poems very popular written by Robert Browning, and they are Pauline, Paracelsus, Sordello, dramatic lyrics, dramatic romances and lyrics, men and women, the Ring and the Book, and so many others. Okay, he has written hundreds of poems, a few dramas, a few plays also. Okay, before we discuss Browning's contribution to English poetry, it is also interesting to know something about the comparison between Browning and Alfred Tennyson, because both were the dominant personalities of Victorian English literature. But the difference, there is much difference between Browning and Tennyson, and the difference is that Alfred Tennyson is considered as the product of his times. Okay, why? Because Tennyson was much influenced by different movements like Oxford movement, like industrial development which was taking place in Europe, like feminism. So Tennyson's poetry reflects the elements of feminism, elements of Oxford movement, influence of industrial revolution. All these things you find in Tennyson. So that's the reason why Tennyson has been considered as the representative poet of the Victorian era. Browning was also writing poetry during the same period of time, but Browning is quite away from all these movements of the Victorian era. His poetry does not reflect these spirits of the time, and that is the reason why in his early age Browning was not celebrated as a great poet. It was only towards the later part of his life that Browning's popularity increased very much in comparison to Tennyson. So, Tennyson in the beginning is considered as the dominant poet. Towards the end of their lives, Browning becomes a more influential poet in Victorian era. All in all, remember Tennyson and Browning. Now, Browning is remembered for his some memorable love poems, and that is the reason why his name has been written with golden letters. When we write golden letters in the history of English literature as a poet of love. Okay, but like we have other poets also who have written love poetry, like we have Shelley, we have John Donne, and so many others. But Browning is very much different from all other poets. Why? Because his concept of love has nothing to do with God, nothing to do with spirituality. Okay, his love is the actual love between man and women. And Stopford Brooke, a very important historian, he has rightly said these things, as you can see in the red lines, The love poems of Browning do not mean those poems which deal with the absolute idea or the love of the ideas as truth and beauty or the love of mankind or country. Okay, so his idea of love has nothing to do with absolute ideas or some spiritual or highly philosophical kind of love. His love means the isolating passion of one sex for the other, of women for the men and men for the women. Okay, chiefly in youth, whether moral or immoral. So, according to this historian, Browning has presented love itself in the realistic manner. Whether it is moral or immoral doesn't matter much. Okay, so Browning's love poems, we can say, they express mostly the physical love, the sensuous love, the fierce animal passion of Otima. Otima is a character, very popular character created by Browning. So Otima's fierce animal instinct or feeling is found in this Pippa Passes. Pippa Passes is the title of his love poem, and the romantic love is also presented by him in his poem, very popular poem, The Last Ride Together. Okay, so one thing that he has nothing to do with spiritualism in case of love. Another important element of his love poems is that his poems are realistic poems. Okay, his love poetry is highly realistic by nature. Why? Because he has expressed the realistic idea that a man loves a woman not for the woman's spiritual qualities but for the physical charm of the woman, that man is attracted towards her. Okay, Creason and Smith, again these historians have also commented regarding this. Mark these words: with her curly hair, dental chin, okay, her little tricks of speech. You know, the lady, the woman uses different tricks of speech to in order to attract men. The causeless laughter, the how the woman laughs and smiles, that is the real thing, and that is the kind of love poetry Browning is a master, right? So these critics also believe the same thing, that he gives the realistic touch to his love poetry. Here in his love poems, we do not find the stars, the skies, the beautiful clouds, the fairies, and the mountains as we generally see in most romantic poetry. Here in Browning's poetry, we find realistic day to day objects like piano, okay, or some streets from the city, medicine bottles, fashionable clothes. All these objects are realistically presented by him in his poetry, and that is the reason why G.K. Chesterton, a critic of Browning, said that Browning's love poetry is the finest in the world because it does not talk about raptures and ideals and the gates of heaven. So Browning does not fly high towards the gates of heaven. He remains on the ground, and that's the reason why his poetry is realistic poetry. Moreover, another important thing to note about his poetry is that here we find different shades of love. All shades of love are presented by Browning. Okay, like say for example, he has written poems on successful love, he has written poems on unsuccessful love also. He has written poems on physical love. He has also written poems on romantic love. Okay, so all such different aspects of love have been presented by Robert Browning. Some of his poems present men's successful love, okay, but in some other poems men are presented as disappointed people in love. Okay, what are his important love poems? These are the titles: By the Fireside, One Wood More, Love in a Lifetime, One Way of Love, and all such poems are very popular. Okay, Crompton Rickett has said this thing about the comprehensiveness in his poetry. He said that certain aspects of love have been more finely rendered by other poets, but in range of matter, as far as the variety is concerned, as far as the comprehensiveness of subject matter is concerned, Browning has no superior. That means he wants to say that Browning was on top as far as the comprehensiveness is concerned. Moreover, the most important contribution by Robert Browning to English poetry is his dramatic monologues. In fact, he has been considered as the father of dramatic monologues. He has used this device of dramatic monologues in his poetry. Now, before we discuss his use of dramatic monologues, let me explain to you what a dramatic monologue is. It's a device which is used by Browning in his poetry. Here, what happens in his poems, he has presented some character, one character, okay, that character speaks the whole poem. Means the character is delivering a long speech, and there is one imaginative listener who listens to this speech. Okay, mono means one, and log means speech. Speech delivered by one single person is called monologue. Dramatic monologue is the poetic technique. Here, a speech is delivered by one single character and addressed to one another character to convince something. Okay, monologue provides us a dramatic touch to poetry. Okay, and it gives us a psychological insight of the character. Browning has been appreciated as a great dramatist also. He had these dramatic skills. In the beginning, I told you he has written a few dramas also. He has written some plays also. But unfortunately, he did not, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't know, he did not become successful as a dramatist. But his art of writing drama is successfully used and found in all his poems, and that is why we consider him as not as a dramatist, not as a poet, but we see him as a dramatic poet. Okay, his dramatic art is successfully reflected in all his poems. Why? Because he has used this device of dramatic monologues successfully. Okay, in his dramatic monologues, he has portrayed a wide variety of characters belonging to different classes of life. Like we have some cowards, we have some scholars, musicians, painters, cheats, all different kinds of people have been created and presented by Browning in his poetry. Another important feature about his poetry is his philosophy of life. In many of his poems, we find his great optimism, positive approach to life. Okay, his poems like Rebbe Ben Ezra and Abt Vogler, here these poems reveal or express his philosophical mind. He seems to be a different poet in comparison to other Victorian poets as far as the philosophy of life is concerned. I told you, he can be compared with Tennyson. So when we see other Victorian poets, what do we see? Mostly we see despair and melancholy and gloomy atmosphere presented by most romantic poets during the most Victorian poets during the 19th century. But Browning is a different man. He is a different poet, and he has presented his hope and optimism in all his poems. He has strong faith in God, and that is the reason why, in the character Paracelsus, we find these lines. This character Paracelsus declares his faith in God. Thus he dwells in all. He means God. The poet believes that God stays in all, everyone, from life's minute beginnings at last to man. So, even in the smallest objects, there is the existence of God. Okay, everywhere there is God. If you compare Browning with Thomas Hardy was also a late Victorian novelist. Thomas Hardy had a very harsh opinion about God and faith, but Browning does not consider God as cruel or tyrannical. God is a friend to mankind. This is what he believed. He considers God as a soothing power. God consoles us. God boosts us, okay, in our bad days. And that's why he wrote these lines. Read these lines. God made all creatures. God has created all of us and gave them our love and our fear. God has given us love. God has given us fear. We and they are all His children, one family here. So Browning considers everyone as the child of God and considers this universe as one family. The whole concept of Vasudeva Kutumbakam has been presented in this line. In one of his songs, Pipa songs, there also he has written these very positive lines. God is in his heaven and all is well with the world. All is right with the world. Okay, so kind of optimism, positive approach you find in Browning's poetry. Read this line. Strive means to try. Strive, thrive, and try. Speed. Fight on forever. Okay, don't lose hope. This is the message given by Robert Browning. So, with these examples, you can prove that Browning was a man of hope, was a man of positive attitude to life. He was a poet of optimism. Okay, the last point which I want to discuss here is the element of obscurity in his poetry. Browning, many readers find his poetry as difficult poetry. They find it difficult to understand and analyze. Okay, why? Because there is much obscurity in his poetry. His thoughts are not clearly presented sometimes in some of his poems. Okay, his style of presentation also lacks the simplicity of presentation. And Douglas Jerrold was unhappy. Jerrold himself was a great thinker and a poet. He said that, my God, I am an idiot. I can't understand even two consecutive lines in an English poem. When Douglas was reading this Sordello is a popular poem written by Browning. When he was reading this poem, he said that I am an idiot, I don't understand anything from this Browning's poem. Another incident is that once it so happened that a student was reading his poetry, he could not understand the meaning of the poem, and that's why the student goes to Browning's home and asks Browning himself to explain that poem. At that time, Browning very jocularly, means in a happy mood, laughing at himself, Browning says these lines. He said that when I wrote this poem, only two persons knew the meaning. Who two persons? Browning himself and God. But he now says that when I read this poem, only one person knows the meaning, God knows. Okay, so this is what we see in Browning's poems, the element of obscurity. For some readers, Browning is a difficult poet. Anyways, now let's come to the conclusion and let's say that Browning was the second most important poet of the Victorian era after Lord Alfred Tennyson. Browning is remembered for his great contribution in the field of poetry. Why? Because he has contributed dramatic monologues. Okay, he is known for his, though there is obscurity in his poetry, though his poems are sometimes difficult, he is still remembered in the history of English literature as one of the greatest love poets. Why? Because all shades of love with a positive attitude, with optimism, have been presented by Browning in his love poems. So, here we come to the end. If you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section. And if you really like the video, please share your opinion in the comment section. Thank you for watching. Thank you.